What's up guys? Recently, Blizzard came out with a pretty big patch with some sizable buffs for Druid, including some fairly large changes for the Shred build. Naturally, I wanted to revisit the build and see how much better it felt. In the background, you're going to see a level 80 dungeon that I decided to hop into after barely optimizing my gear just to see if the build works, and I couldn't believe the damage I was seeing. I decided to go over some old footage and I noticed something really interesting with the aspect Stormclaw. I hadn't seen this the first time I'd made the build. The aspect says that it should be doing 30% of the damage of Shred when Shred crits, but what I was seeing was much larger numbers ranging anywhere from 2 to 3 times as big as the Shred crit. I tried looking into this, but it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what mechanics are at play without some sort of combat log. The best answer I could come up with was that Stormclaw was actually double dipping on certain damage multipliers. Now, what do I mean by this? The simplest example I can provide is when we take a look at the vulnerable stat. If the enemy has the vulnerable status, they will take more damage. So if you apply vulnerable, then use Shred, your Shred will do more damage, which in turn means your Stormclaw will also be a bigger number. But when the Stormclaw damage is applied, it will also check for damage modifiers such as vulnerable and then apply them again. It was difficult to test, but I think any modifier that could apply to Stormclaw's damage would actually work twice. Some other multipliers would be heightened malice, ancestral guidance, damage to poisoned enemies, damage while fortified, damage while shapeshifted. I'm guessing the only tag that Stormclaw has is lightning damage and nothing else like core or werewolf. So what I tried to do was get any source of damage multiplier that could apply to both the damage of Shred and the damage of Stormclaw. With that in mind, the Paragon board ended up looking a bit different than normal. I tried to maximize every glyph I added and put as many stats in them as I could while making sure to pick up Heightened Malice and Ancestral Guidance for their multipliers. The build felt pretty good, but there was one more new mechanic I learned about and added into the build. I started looking at the Blurred Beast aspect and wondering if I could fit it in. I'll be honest, it's still very hard to tell how much damage this is actually adding to Shred. But the key component about Blurred Beast is it actually makes it so that you can activate Stormclaw on every target you hit with the aspect. It's effectively a huge AoE increase to Shred, and on top of that, it has the ability to cause AoE overlaps for Stormclaw. Anytime you see a huge group of enemies stacked up and dive in with the 100% crit from waxing, you'll see tons of Stormclaws going off. The next step to maxing out Blurred Beast was combining Tempest Roar with Toxic Claws and Hurricane. What this does is as soon as we jump into a pack of monsters, everything will be instantly poisoned because of our high crit chance, which enables us to start jumping around and getting all of our procs. Now, this was just my first pass of the build, so you'll see there's still some issues that need to be fixed. The first obvious one is that if you don't have Grizzly Rage up, it feels pretty bad. We don't really have a great way to trigger Calm Before the Storm, so we're left with anywhere from 10 to 15 seconds of downtime. Another issue I had was sometimes I would just lose my character and he would jump to somewhere I wasn't expecting and then suddenly take huge damage. Another problem I had was the single target damage. Most of the time you'll be doing pretty mediocre damage, but then all of a sudden when everything lines up perfectly, you'll see crits of 2 to 3 million on Shred and then Stormclaw doing anywhere from 5 to 10 million. But all that being said, I think those are things that really are only problems when pushing very high nightmare dungeons. I've definitely not optimized my gear to be the best it can be either, so I can easily see this build pushing all the way up into the 90s now. Taking a look at the skill tree, it's remained relatively the same as the first version of the build I had, with some changes here and there. We have Storm Strike because we're using Tempest Roar. We're able to use this during Grizzly Rage. We have the upgrade to Vulnerable. This is going to help keep Vulnerable up on single targets when our exploit glyph falls off, along with the damage reduction as a melee character feels very nice. Down here, we have Shred leveled up, and then we go all the way down here to Primal Shred. This makes it so that we have an increased critical strike damage, which is very good with the stacking crit damage we get from rampaging. Also, this makes it so our second and third attack on Shred will dash, making it so that we can trigger Blurred Beast on all 3 attacks, which is very important. We have a point in Heart of the Wild, so we can get Wild Impulses. Core Seals cost more, but deal more damage. We have 3 points here for 6% crit. We still want crit, even though we'll have 100% crit with waxing, because there will be times when you don't have the buff up, when you're fighting single targets or you need to get the crit. I have 2 points in here for movement speed for now until I figure out where else to put them. Then we move down here. Currently I have Cyclone Armor maxed out to Preserving Cyclone Armor. This is quite good for a melee build that wants to dive into enemies. Every 10 seconds you'll basically get a nice damage reduction buff that when you jump in, you'll be protected. Then we have Blood Howl upgraded to Enhanced so that whenever we get kills, we reduce the cooldowns, and then we can increase the attack speed for 4 seconds. This is the first thing. If you notice you're having spirit troubles, take a point out of here and put it into Innate Blood Howl. Blood Howl spamming will allow us to keep up Vigilance, which is 15% damage reduction for 6 seconds. A very important core part of a lot of Druid builds. Down here we have Hurricane, which is really important for the build. Now you have an option with Hurricane. You can actually go for Natural Hurricane. This will give you much better vulnerable uptime when you're fighting harder monsters, but you won't actually need this if you're fighting monsters that die quickly because your exploit glyph is going to put up vulnerable. Now this will help, like I said, if the monsters live past exploit, but the other option is making monsters deal 20% less damage. So if you're fighting harder monsters, you might want this instead anyway, but don't be afraid to switch these back and forth, whichever one you like more. We have Elemental Exposure here. This makes it so that we have like a little bit better chance to get vulnerable with our Storm Strike, and then Hurricane has a little bit of chance to apply vulnerable. Then we have Increased Duration of Hurricane. Hurricane is just great. Like I said, it slows, it can damage reduce, it can apply vulnerable, it applies poisons with our next thing we have here, which is Toxic Claw. With Tempest Roar, our Hurricane is considered a werewolf skill. So when it crits, because we have a 100% crit chance with waxing, which it will crit a lot, we apply poison on everything, which enables all our poison modifiers. So very, very good, including Envenom, which is multiplicative crit damage. So really good combination. Down here, we have Grizzly Rage. We have makes it unstoppable, and then we gain Fortify. This is our main source of Fortify gain, and to enhance this, we actually have 3 points in defensive posture, so we get more Fortify. Then we have points in Nature's Resolve. Whenever we get hit, we have a chance to gain Fortify. And then I've been kind of trying this out since we have so many problems outside of Grizzly Rage. I was trying this to see if it was noticeable. I think it's been fine so far. Again, you don't have too many places to put points. I would say that pulling points out of here and other places, if Blurred Beast scaling is really good, you could definitely put it into Rabies and look to do something like that. But again, it's really hard to test that kind of stuff, so feel free to mess around with that and see if you notice any difference. Finally, we have Lupine Frosty. This got buffed recently, so it feels even better now. The one downside to this is it's a little hard to line it up with the third hit of Shred because your Hurricane is getting ticks, your Storm Strike will consume ticks. You might get this proc on the second or third part of Shred, which doesn't do very much damage, so I wouldn't try to line this up, but you know, sometimes you'll get it, sometimes you can go for it, but when it does hit, it hits extremely hard and it feels really good. Moving on to our gear now. As always, make sure you check the D4 build linked down below and mouse over the pieces. I'll have the best in slot stats listed on them. On our helmet, we're back to Tempest Roar. I know this is really hard to get. You can play the build without Tempest Roar, but this is really what's going to enable a lot of your spirit regeneration. And it's not because of the lucky hit, it's because Hurricane becomes a werewolf skill and works really well with Lust for Carnage. So again, you can play without this, but this is going to make the build feel very, very good. Pretty much you don't have to worry about any of the rolls on here either. They're kind of whatever. It's just that your base storm skills are now werewolf skills, so don't sweat too much. Here we have chest piece. I have tons of damage reduction with some life and armor. Here you can put, you can see I just have the codex version of the vigorous aspect for 10%. You could also do might. Might is technically better damage reduction if you want to weave Storm Strike in between every 6 seconds, which if you're pushing higher content, you probably wanted to be doing that anyway for the damage reduction. So keep that in mind. You can put might here instead. On the gloves, you can see I just grabbed a pair of gloves out of my stash that are not very good whatsoever. It's not even 4 on Shred, but you want Shred, crit chance, attack speed. And then the last one, I'm not entirely sure which you should go for. You can go for Storm Skill cooldown reduction, which will help keep Hurricane up more often. You could go for a little bit of crit damage, but again, since we're rampaging, flat crit damage doesn't have as much value as it should. So yeah, don't sweat too much about that. You could go Lucky Hit, but Lucky Hit's kind of weird in this build. On the pants, same thing as the chest piece. We have lots of damage reduction, armor, and life. This has felt the best to me so far. We have Disobedience as our aspect. This has quite high uptime in this build, again, thanks to Hurricane, but also applying poison to enemies. Poison ticks will put up Disobedience stacks. So we're applying poison and constantly doing that. So we'll have our stacks up On the boots, we have Ghostwalker. I think Ghostwalker is actually quite important for this build, mainly because whenever you want to use Blurred Beast, you need to kind of step back a little bit, and then so you can dash in. You won't actually get the dash if you are standing right in melee range on something. So being able to move through enemies allows us to easily move and dash where we want to, if we're stuck in melee range. Willpower, damage reduction while injured, movement speed, total armor while in werewolf form. I think these are probably the best stats you can get on a pair of boots like this. The weapon, I have a waxing gibbous. I've mentioned this before, but the main thing you want to look for, probably over anything else, generally is the item power. The higher the item power will mean it'll have higher DPS. The stats on it, not too important. Those would be like last. The second thing I would recommend to look for is a high duration on the proc itself. So, you want to try to get over 2 seconds of the duration if possible, but I'd say go for a high item level, then try to get a good duration. And then you want to look at I'd say damage to close enemies would probably be the next thing you want to try to get high on. The lifeline kill is kind of whatever. Damage to injured enemies, not bad. Critical strike damage is probably like the worst out of the 3 damage ones. On the necklace, again, I have a low rolled Stormclaw because I was just trying to test this stuff out. The biggest things you want is ranks 2 in Venom and cooldown reduction. Cooldown reduction is going to help with Grizzly Rage, and Venom is going to be big damage. And then after that, you can go for whatever you want if you want damage reduction or damage for the 2 things. But this is where I'm actually putting Stormclaw because Stormclaw is just insane damage. You could make an argument for Blurred Beast here. You could also put Direwolf here if you're having spirit problems. But I think in the late game when you don't have spirit problems anymore, I think Stormclaw is going to be the best on the necklace, but that would require some more testing. On the rings, I have Lucky Hit on my rings currently just because that's what I had. Vulnerable damage is the most important thing. Then critical strike chance, I actually think life feels really good. And then after that, you could go for something like damage to close enemies, damage to poison enemies. You can, again, get critical strike damage, but it doesn't really do too much in rampaging builds. Here I have Grizzly Rage, Direwolf, so that whenever we click Grizzly Rage, we turn a wolf instead of a bear. Pretty important. Getting the spirit cost reduction up will be pretty nice. That's one of the biggest ways to make the spirit feel better. Next ring, we have Rampaging. This is going to increase the duration of our Grizzly Rage, and this is where we get all of our critical strike damage, which is really important. You're going to be stacking this up tons with Hurricane, so it'll feel really good. On the Totem, I have a low rolled crit chance, as you can see, but ideally you would want high cooldown reduction, high crit chance, and then probably damage reduction while fortified, damage reduction against poison enemies. This was the best I had for something like this. Obviously not very good at all. This is currently where I have Blurred Beast with a pretty decent roll. Again, this might be better on the necklace. I don't know. It's hard to tell the damage of Blurred Beast if I'm being honest. For the gems and the armor, we have damage reduction while fortified. I actually was considering maybe you go for the topazes where you have damage reduction while crowd controlled. Could be really interesting in a build like this because again, we are most vulnerable when we are not in Grizzly Rage. We're fairly tanky and have quite high damage reduction while fortified already. So I would maybe consider going topazes here, but I've not tested that. Could be an option. On the weapons, you actually have a few choices here. Again, critical strike damage is not super great in this kind of build. So critical strike damage to vulnerable or critical strike damage to crowd control, since we're applying poison and neurotoxin for the slow. They both work, but something like damage over time on the, I believe it's Amethyst, might actually be better than critical strike damage. That also requires some testing, but keep that in mind. On the jewelry, we're looking at skulls for armor. For the elixirs, the defensive elixirs, you have Iron Skin for armor or Elixir of Fortitude for maximum life. On the offensive side, you can go for Assault for attack speed, or you can actually go for Cruelty for crit chance. Again, you have 100% crit chance with waxing, but there are times when you don't have waxing up and crit chance feels really good with the build, so keep that in mind. For the spirit boons, in deer, we have wariness, damage reduction against elite. In eagle, I think you have a couple options here. You can go for attack speed. This will make the build feel better overall. Again, you have critical strike chance as an option as well, which could make the build feel better as well, if you don't have waxing up, but I think ideally you would have waxing up so attack speed would feel better. If you're feeling a little squishy, you can always grab Iron Feather as well for this setup. In the next category in Wolf, we have Calamity, extend the duration of our ultimate skills by 25%, so make our Grizzly Rage last longer. Finally, in Snake, I currently have Calm Before the Storm. This does have a chance to proc off of Hurricane, but I think it can only proc once per Hurricane, so it's really awkward. But even if it procs once, that's 2 seconds off. Sometimes you use Storm Strike, that could proc. Is this the best? Probably not, but anything that reduces the cooldown of our Grizzly Rage is gonna make the build feel better, so maybe it is. But for sure, you want to make sure you get Masochistic. This is absolutely insane healing because Hurricane becomes a shapeshifting skill. This will make it so that Hurricane, every time it ticks and crits because you have Waxing, you're getting healing back. So very, very strong. Taking a look at the Paragon tree, this is kind of what I've thrown together just at a first pass. I think it's pretty solid. It feels pretty tanky and good damage. But I'm sure there's tons of improvements that can be made. We work our way up, and normally you can put Exploit here first as you're leveling up before you get on later. But here we have Territorial because we put Exploit into a different slot later. Territorial will make it so that we gain damage reduction against close enemies. And this is where you can see I have 77% damage to close enemies, where I assume it will double dip on Stormclaw. Then we move up into Heightened Malice. So we have Heightened Malice node over here, which is multiplicative damage. If we have 3 or more poison enemies nearby, we're poisoning enemies with Toxic Claw, which will work on Shred and Hurricane. So this will be up anytime we have 3 or more enemies nearby, which again, I think will double dip. Moving over here, we have Fang and Claw. While we're in werewolf form, close enemies take increased damage. You can see what we're kind of going for here. And you can see we have damage to poisoned enemies and damage reduction from poison enemies. We have a bunch of damage nodes here that I think probably double dip with Stormclaw. Damage to poisoned enemies. We have damage to elites and then more damage to poison enemies. Then you want to move over into here next, Lust for Carnage. This is going to be your best node for spirit regeneration. It synergizes really well with Waxing crit chance. We have some attack speed over here. We move here to Undaunted. You can pick up one more int node here, but I didn't feel good doing a strength and an int node for that. But you can see we have 97% damage while fortified, and we gain up to 10% damage reduction the more fortified we have. So I believe this would work with double dipping. Moving over here, we want to go where do we have Thunderstruck. We want to go to Thunderstruck tree next so we can get the bonuses, mainly because we have damage reduction from vulnerable enemies here. This is kind of why I like the vulnerable node on Hurricane sometimes, because this will help you have better vulnerable uptime. So it kind of keeps our damage reduction from vulnerable enemies up. I do have points in Storm skill damage. We don't actually really use the Storm skill damage. This was more for the willpower. This is for our Werewolf glyph. You gain 10% damage reduction while in Werewolf form. And then we have 92.4% damage while in Werewolf form. Over here, if I had my perfect gloves, ideally, I think I would have a willpower on them. And then this would activate this bonus here. So we get another 4% damage reduction while fortified. But this is just some defensive nodes to make it so we can stay in fighting enemies longer. Then you want to move on over to the Constricting Tendrils board. This is where we have Exploit maxed out with 49 dex for almost 40% vulnerable damage. Vulnerable seems to be the biggest multiplier, of course, who would have guessed, and will do the most damage with Stormclaw. So we wanted to max this out as best as we could. Then we'll move on over here. Finally, we have the Ancestral Guidance board. 2 Spirit on kill. This can help you out if you notice you're having some spirit issues. Probably don't need it, but I have it in for now. Then we have Ancestral Guidance. The thing with Ancestral Guidance is it's a little bit awkward uptime with a shred because you're using shreds that don't cost spirit. But I think overall it's still pretty good uptime. That's going to be it from me. I hope you guys give this build a whirl. I think it's actually insane right now. I'm honestly not sure if Stormclaw is working correctly or incorrectly, but it feels amazing. It's so fun. It's so fast. Still a top favorite build of mine. Let me know if you guys like it or if you've tried it down below. Otherwise, until next time, I'll see you guys later.